morning, everyone. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Amanda Haddock from the Dragon Master Foundation. Mrs. Haddock began the foundation after her son, David, was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, which, as many of you probably know, doesn't usually have a happy ending. And having had a friend who was diagnosed with GBM at age 39, and that didn't have a happy ending either. It's a pretty horrible diagnosis, and there hasn't been a tremendous amount of progress in the past few decades for people who do get that diagnosis. Part of the reason for this is that aside from a few high-profile projects, it's very difficult to have access to the type of detailed, clinically relevant data that's required to understand the roots and the risks and the progression factors involved with horrible diseases like this. It's even worse in children because, thankfully, childhood tumors are rare. Unfortunately, they are not rare enough. They're certainly not absent. And when you're dealing with rare diseases, it's even that much more important for people to have the ability to put the puzzle pieces together in a way that makes sense and that's clinically relevant. So the Dragon Master Foundation started out realizing that access to this to a broader slice of the population of researchers and citizen scientists was going to be pretty important to the types of progress that needs to happen for these diagnoses to go the way of something like lymphoblastic leukemia, which a lifetime ago, virtually none of the children diagnosed with it survived. And this is the most common of childhood cancers. Nowadays, about 96% of children who are diagnosed with ALL will go into durable remission for at least 5 years, and most of them for a lifetime. And they may also have a lifetime of side effects, but this represents definite progress. And it was catalyzed by decades of grinding optimization trials, trying to figure out the right combination of treatments and the right doses, occasional breakthroughs for relapsed patients, such as chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy. But at the end of the day, it's possible to flip the survival curve for some of these diseases. And it's happened a few times in leukemia. It's happened a few times for a handful of other tumors marked by very specific features for which drugs could be created that directly target the causative agent. But for many, if not most, malignancies, that's simply not the case. Now, as progress towards that goal, the Dragon Master Foundation has funded Kavatica, which is a huge platform for the Childhood Brain Tumor Network, organized collaboratively by Seven Bridges, by Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania, and with no small part due to funding and support from the Dragon Master Foundation. In addition, to incentivize researchers to share and also to partake in the ecosystem of data on rare and malignant diseases, the Dragon Master Foundation now supports the Research Symbiont Award. Now, this is an award granted annually for not just a research parasite or a research producer, neither a host nor a parasite, but somebody who participates in both aspects of this data ecosystem. That a healthy data ecosystem moves forward treatment, diagnosis, and the minimal side effects for cure of any number of rare diseases and increasingly common diseases with rare subtypes. So I'd like to acknowledge the enormous progress. In 2 years, that's not too bad. And in 2 years that have been marked by a global pandemic, it's pretty damn good. So I'd like to recognize the tremendous progress that really one person with an awful lot of support can show is possible in just a couple of years. So from Kansas, please welcome Amanda Haddock from the Dragon Master Foundation.
Wow. Well, that was a very lovely welcome. Thank you, Tim. And thanks to everyone. I'm seeing lots of stuff pop up on the screen, so that's super fun in our very, very virtual world these days. I feel like Tim just told you just about everything I'm going to say. So I'm going to dive a little deeper on some of the story sides of things. Before I get too deep into things, I will say that I'm pretty old school. While I do feel like I've got a good handle on technology, I may or may not be on top of things well enough to respond to the chat as we go. But I definitely want to hear from all of you if you have questions or thoughts along the way. So please do put those in chat or like somehow let us know. And if Tim or someone else can answer those, that'd be great. And otherwise, we'll definitely cover that at the end. I'm just not always like super Johnny on the spot with being able to answer that on the fly. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you guys so that we can get started here. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so I'm more active than the foundation, but both of those handles are there. Please feel free to reach out there as well if we don't have time to get into something today. So as Tim said, I'm Amanda Haddock, and I'm one of the co-founders of Dragon Master Foundation. And I'm really excited actually to speak to all of you today because this crowd of people, you guys are kind of my heroes, right? Like you're doing amazing things that I only kind of sort of understand enough to really appreciate the efforts, but unfortunately not enough to aid them in any significant ways like I would like to. But I'm kind of challenged today with giving you the patient perspective. And I'm not sure that any single person can ever really do that. But what I can do is kind of give you the perspective that my family had as we went through treatment with David. And also what I've learned since then, trying to be an advocate for others and funding different research projects and things. So when you're faced with a cancer diagnosis, the immediate reaction is to turn to an oncologist, right? That's who we go to for guidance and for help. And while that's the direct link for patients, they're not really the only person a patient needs, right? There's all of these people behind the scenes, and most of us could guess at who some of those are: nurses and radiologists and all sorts of different medical staff that are helping. But I believe that some of the most critical people in the equation are the people attending this conference. But I'm not really sure all of you totally know that. I don't know that you feel that you're making that kind of difference every day. So I kind of wanted to share the patient experience so that you can understand how urgent and how important your role is in trying to save people's lives. So a little background on me first. I started programming when I was just a kid, and I started with a Commodore 64. If anybody is old enough to recognize that, you could put something in chat and like show me that I'm not the only ancient person in the room. But yeah, my uncle had bought one for his business and didn't know how to use it, and I begged my parents to buy it from him, and so I was able to start with that at a pretty young age. And then I saved up my money. I was the first kid at my school to have an Apple II certification. And then I saved up my money for that very portable Macintosh that you can see on the right. It was only 16.5 pounds. So I took that thing everywhere. I was introduced to FileMaker Pro, I think, pretty soon after that software launched. And I just thought, well, with this, you can organize like literally anything in the world. So it only took me a couple of years to realize how very, very wrong I was about that. And these days, I don't do much with the data sets. And I leave all of that work to people like you. You're the one that are making complex data sets work, and I'm very happy to be on the user interface side of things. Over here on my side, interfaces keep improving, but mostly in relation to just very true consumer applications, right? Shopping is very quick and intuitive on sites as large as Amazon and as small as my local grocery store. But as vast as those data sets are, they're not nearly as complex as the medical data that we're asking all of you to make sense of. So how do patients fit into all of this, and why is it important for them? In the summer of 2010, my son David was 16 years old. He was a soccer player and a referee. He loved roller coasters. He liked playing tennis and going water skiing. He loved nature and animals. And he really, really loved being thought of as a geek. He was the type of kid that took Latin just for the fun of it. And he read every single book he could get his hands on. He wanted to be a chef. And he was weird and funny and sweet. And he had an aggressive tumor growing in his brain. To say that we were blindsided by a brain cancer diagnosis is just really a vast understatement. He was so healthy and vital. We had no idea anything was wrong. So how did my beautiful boy go from healthy and happy to terminal in what seemed like a day? David presented with migraine-level headaches and memory loss. That's what the doctors will tell you. If they're being honest, they would also tell you that they weren't sure at first if David had leukemia or brain cancer. We were at an NCI-designated cancer center, but at first they told us he had leukemia. That is a gross misdiagnosis, not only because there's very little to confuse between those two diseases, but also because if he had had leukemia, he might still be here today. We found out that it wasn't leukemia because of the first testing of the tumor tissue. The data showed us what we were really dealing with. And it's probably important to note here that most of David's tissue was sent to a database at St. Jude where it was de-identified for research. However, we had asked that some of his tissue be saved because we were starting to hear about clinical trials and treatments that were using a patient's own tumor tissue to develop things like vaccines. And we thought that that might be something that David would be eligible for. So we were very specific in asking that some of his tissue be saved back for his use. But that request was ignored. And since that was David's only surgery, we didn't really ever have a chance to take advantage of those kinds of therapies. Back then, the patient's voice was not very empowered. But luckily, that landscape is changing. We weren't offered any genomic testing of the tumor. By the way, I guess I should tell you that it's not only David in these pictures, but his little sister, Austin, is also in several of them. They didn't offer us any genomic testing, but they did do a test for methylation. And right at that time, there was some research around the methylation. They were just beginning to be able to figure out that patients who were MGMT positive were living longer, probably because they had a better response to the standard of care drug, which was Tumor. Unfortunately, David was MGMT negative. His doctors weren't very convinced of the accuracy of this test, but considering they were also the ones that thought maybe he had had leukemia, we were not very convinced of their abilities. So since we didn't have the strongest faith in those doctors, we took David to a different NCI designated cancer center. This time, we went to one that had a more specialized team that dealt with brain tumors. They were also kind of cautious about the MGMT test, but they felt like there was strong enough evidence that we should at least consider some clinical trials. Okay, so clinical trials, that is a super scary term, especially if you're coming from outside of the medical field, which we were. It sounded like an experiment, and all I could think of were all the sci-fi movies I had watched as a kid where they're like hooking people up to electrodes and doing terrible things to them. And I thought, no, like this is my baby. I don't want to put him through that. But the reality was that we were facing an almost certain death within a few months or a clinical trial. And so we talked it over with David, softening as much as we could the potential dying part. And he really felt like clinical trials were worth it because he wanted to help advance the science. And he thought that kids deserved a guarantee of getting to live. What kind of went unsaid was that they probably wouldn't learn enough to be able to help David during this clinical trial. but he knew that he would make a difference. And from that experience, they would learn enough to maybe help someone else. So we told the doctor that he wanted to do a clinical trial, and we were able to find some clinical trials for David. But there was hardly any data that related to how to choose a trial or which one he might find successful. When it came time to choose, our very kind and caring doctor gave us a list of 3 that David qualified for, and he said, pick one. And when we asked him how, he said, you just have to choose. I'd like to say that we chose based on the highest probability of success, but that data was unknown. They really didn't know if any of the trials would have any degree of success. Mostly because the data wasn't available even to the clinicians. The researchers had, some idea of what they were working on, but they were all phase 1, very early trials. So we picked based on the side effects and just hoped that we could give David a really high quality of life and extend his life long enough for, if this trial didn't work, at least maybe he could try another one after that. And I really do believe that the clinical trials gave us more quality time with David, but ultimately they did not save his life. David died at age 18, just 20 months after his diagnosis. And as Tim alluded to, in the 9 years since David has passed, very little has happened to change the outcome for patients with high-grade gliomas. David left us with one mandate. And I'll digress here just for a second to say that David always had more faith in people as individuals and as a society than we frequently have for ourselves. From the time that he was just a little bitty guy, he was always volunteering me for projects that were way beyond my skill set. And somehow we always managed to pull things off. So when he told me that he wanted me to help other kids with cancer, I truly believe that he wanted me to be part of finding cures for these kids. And I know that sounds pretty outrageous since I'm not a cancer researcher or work at all in that field, but that was David. He was audacious enough to believe that this is within our capabilities. And I believe it too. After David died, we kept looking for answers. We had already been fundraising, but now we had time to go to scientific conferences. And it was at one of those conferences that we heard Dr. Anna Barker say if she could compare 50,000 genomes, then she thought we could probably cure brain cancer. You know those moments in the movies where the world goes still and the main character is there, but like everything is still swirling around them? That's what her comment felt like to me. Everything else in the room just kind of became a buzz, just noise and motion. And it all just sort of ceased to matter because I had just heard the one thing that resonated with me. And I looked at my husband and I knew that he had heard it too. This was why we were here. So after her speech, we jumped up and we ran after her as she was leaving the stage. And I clearly remember going up to her and just thinking, this is the brashest thing I've ever done, because she had been at the NIH and she was this super well-respected researcher. She was research royalty and we were just the commoners, but she stepped out with us and she very kindly answered my rapid fire questions. And if you haven't yet figured it out, I can get a little excited when I'm passionate about something. So we ask her, why? Why aren't we doing what you said on stage? Why aren't we comparing genomes like you mentioned? And she patiently explained to us that they couldn't. The files were too big. They didn't have room and they didn't have the technology that they needed to work with those genomes if we had them. It was just way more complicated than they knew how to deal with. And it was a lot more complicated than stringing together some hard drives. So I gave you some background on myself and on David, but I did not tell you about my husband. He's the real geek. We're talking about learned to program on punch cards and started his own software company at 19. He served on Apple Computer's reseller board. He is a super geek. And he knows all about data infrastructure and hardware, and he knew what we would need for the kind of undertaking that we were discussing. I think that Dr. Barker thought she was telling us that this was an impossible project, but we really didn't see it that way. We heard difficult, and we heard expensive, but impossible never really entered our minds. Even back then, entities like the NSA and Amazon were already making the news for their big data escapades. And we had no doubt that the data that Dr. Barker wanted could be accumulated and used. It was just that no one wanted to dedicate the resources to make it happen. We knew that radical change needed to happen in the research space if we were going to offer kids like David any hope. And we believed that big data was the best way to bring about that change. If shared and integrated, the data that you collect and analyze becomes a critical component to changing the outcome for patients like David. And we're living in a time where that change is beginning to happen. But back in 2012, we had to go looking for people who shared our view of the problem. We wanted to find people who wanted to use big data and newer technology to look for answers. And we didn't really feel the need to have our own foundation. We knew David would not care if his name was on something. So we just set out to find some projects that we could improve upon. And time again, every time we would find a project that looked like it might be the one, on closer examination, they were always too small in scope. We would talk with these various project organizers, and it left us really frustrated because no one really shared our vision of what the data could do. We wanted to put genomic data alongside clinical data, and we wanted biosamples there too, so that we could enable patient care and research at the same time. We wanted a system that would guide patients based on their own unique identifiers. And we knew that the data could be used in more prospective ways, that it could both ease the patient's journey and speed research at the same time. But as we learned more, our vision just kept growing bigger, and it became more and more apparent that we weren't getting a lot of support from the existing entities. So, about a year after David died, we started Dragon Master Foundation to put better technology into the hands of researchers. And we thought that we were going to have to build those tools from scratch. I was in negotiations with IBM for the donation of a twin fin server, and we were looking at where we could possibly house that to meet all of the security standards that we thought we were going to need to address. We were quite literally looking at building like some Amazon-sized server farm in some remote part of Kansas so we could like protect it like Fort Knox. Luckily, about that same time, we were introduced to a team at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and they were working on a project that sounded pretty promising. So we flew to Philadelphia to meet with them. And finally, we felt like we had found a project that had a roadmap that we could support. And that was a huge relief because we were so far out of our league. We did not have the funding or the support that we needed to do this kind of project, but we knew it had to be done. And so we were just going to figure out a way to do it anyway. And I love that we actually took this picture because it really was our very, very first meeting with them. But I hate that we didn't think of doing it earlier when all of the people were in the room. So this is just part of the team that we met with that very first day in Philadelphia. And back then, they were calling themselves the Children's Brain Tumor Tissue Consortia. But now they're known as Children's Brain Tumor Network. And so for the last 8 years, we've been working alongside that team. And we did help launch the genomic database that Tim mentioned earlier, Kavatica. And that platform is used to house data from the NIH's Gabriella Miller Kids First Data Resource Center. I think that it's a growing and exciting project, and I'd like to think that we bring a different perspective to the work, both as entrepreneurs, but also probably more importantly, as parents who've lost a child to cancer. So that was an awful lot of history to get to this point. Patient families may not know everything that we need to know about using and sharing our data, but we're learning more every day. And we're using the expertise that we do have to try and improve the process, not only for our loved ones, but for everyone. I hear folks in this field mention data contributors, and I know what you mean by that, but truly the contributors are the patients. It's not the people that are accumulating the data. Those are just the data stewards. Patients own their own data, and they're becoming increasingly savvy about how to use it and control it. We're approaching a time where they will actively choose who their stewards will be, and all of you will be challenged with showing how you can serve in that steward capacity in ways that a patient is able to mandate. So let me tell you another story. This time about a young man named Jace. Jace was just a little bit older than David when he was diagnosed, but he was diagnosed in 2019, a full 9 years after David. In that time, we've started sequencing the tumors of brain cancer patients, but still not all of them, and really kind of only the easy ones. And Jace was not an easy one. Jace's tumor was on his brain stem, but like David, he also faced a misdiagnosis in the beginning. Despite going almost immediately to one of the top hospitals in the US, Jace was told that he might have a cyst, not a tumor, on his brain stem. But even though they didn't know for sure what it was, they still recommended the cancer treatment path. Luckily, Jace's family did not like that answer. I mean, why would you put your kid through brainstem radiation if they didn't actually have a tumor? So they sought a second opinion. And in the time that it took for them to go from that hospital to the next hospital for a second opinion, they started learning more and more about the possible diagnosis. How did they do that? Well, I'm sure his parents were probably Google searching things, but without a disease name and just knowing it might be a cyst, that was not very helpful. But they asked for prayers on Facebook, and the community rallied around them and started tagging people. I got tagged, other people I know got tagged, and those brain cancer families rallied around Jace and his family. And this community guessed at what the doctors were still trying to determine and started to explaining to the family what they would need to do if this did turn out to be a tumor, which would be the worst case scenario. From families on Facebook, they learned that Jace's tumor might be inoperable, but it wasn't unreachable. We told them that a biopsy was possible and that it was the only way to truly target the treatment. And because of that knowledge, they sought more cutting-edge care. The next hospital that they went to also couldn't be sure that it was a tumor and not a cyst, but they still didn't offer them a biopsy. So they left that hospital and went on to the next, where they were finally offered a biopsy to determine exactly what it was that was sitting on Jace's brainstem. The news they got was not good. It was DIPG, which stands for diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. It's a highly aggressive brain tumor that is difficult to treat and impossible to cure. It occurs in the area of the brainstem called the pons, which controls many of the body's most vital functions like breathing and blood pressure and heart rate. It has long been considered inoperable, and they told Jace that he probably had about 9 months to live. He could go home and make memories, or he could try a clinical trial. I hope that the similarities between David's story and Jace's story are not lost on all of you, because here's where the story really changes. When Jace went to try to decide if he should do a clinical trial, he was told, well, your tumor has the H3K27M mutation, and there are some clinical trials that are open that are targeting that mutation. You see, in those 9 years since David had died, we had not only started sequencing those tumors, but we had started sharing the data in places like the Children's Brain Tumor Network. And we had learned at least a little about what drives the growth in these aggressive tumors. We were starting to target those drivers, and all of that happened because of sharing the data. Jace had already shared a little bit of his journey on Facebook, but once he started looking at clinical trials, he really stepped up his efforts. He was speaking in DC. There's pictures there of him at the NIH and another at a congressional hearing with some of the other kids who were afflicted by the same disease. Jace really opened lines of communication with the patient community and with government officials, with treating institutions, and the world at large. Every treatment he had, every scan, every side effect was shared, if not with the world at large on Facebook, at least within patient groups that were there. They all compared notes. Major decisions were made with the input from other patient families. And from having that first biopsy to using CBD instead of steroids, Jace's care had a crowdsourced element that's just becoming more and more indicative of today's patient journey. Jace was able to go onto a new class of drug, an imipridone, that had minimal side effects, but also had the capability to shrink the tumor or slow its growth. Because of the data, Jace went on a drug that let him continue to have the college student life. Jace passed his life expectancy with the motto, "I can't die, I'm busy." And even though that drug initially shrunk his tumor, it didn't continue to work over the long term. However, it did do the thing that we were trying to do with David, which was to keep Jace alive long enough for the next treatment to be developed. This next treatment he was going to be able to try was a CAR-T trial. Jace used the data that he had from his sequencing to ask more intelligent questions about potential treatments. In partnership with his doctors, he was able to develop a roadmap based on his clinical markers. He gave feedback, and he pushed for better trial design and treatment modalities. You can see Jace on one side there, as I think they were extracting cells in that picture. I don't remember. Somebody here probably knows better than I do. But in the other picture, it's with a patient who was also going to go on the CAR-T therapy that had been following Jace's journey and was joining that trial because of what they had learned from Jace. By this time, it was 2020. And the researchers were getting data from each patient back faster and faster. And in the case of Dr. Mange's lab at Stanford, where this trial is being conducted, they're getting the data back fast enough to change treatment for each patient. Further, they're using the data from one patient to improve the course of treatment for the next enrollee. So kids who are enrolling on that trial now are having an easier time because of what they learned from Jace and the other first few patients. I really wish that I had a happier end to this story, but last month, Jace developed a brain bleed and he died. I know that he had a lot more living to do, but I also know that his work during his short life mattered. David and Jace both understood that we are facing a difficult scientific problem, but they also believed that they could be part of the solution. I know without a doubt that they both will be. Because of them, there are more researchers and labs sharing data. Because of them, more patients are getting sequenced so that their data can be used to help find the answers. But it's because of you that the data is being empowered and put to work. It's your intelligence and your stamina, but also your wit and your creativity, and most importantly, your pace. It might be hard to stay connected to the purpose of your work when you don't get to see the patients you're helping. So I just wanted to remind you that these aren't data sets and tools, but every data point is a person. It's a David or a Jace who believed in you enough to take a chance, to go through those experimental treatments so that you would have the data to help us all learn more. And today, it's more than just the opportunities that we have to learn from a single patient. More and more, the data is showing that by segregating research by disease or by location in the body, we're missing critical patterns in the mutations that are driving our diseases. The fact that this is a problem is evident to me simply from the fact that since my son died, we've changed the way we categorize this disease. Tumors previously known as glioblastoma multiforme are now being put into a category called diffuse midline gliomas. And that's a class of tumor that also encompasses Jace's diagnosis of DIPG. For decades, we looked at those tumors in silos, and now we know that there's much to be learned by studying them together. More than ever, researchers and clinicians and even patients need to be able to seamlessly cross the boundaries of disease names so that they can integrate and interrogate the data sets in new ways. We need it all to live in an environment where pipelines and tools can be shared. We need to work smarter because I've watched and I know everyone is already working about as hard as they can. And that kind of reminds me of another good example of why we need to make this data more interoperable. Since that first meeting at CHOP, I've developed a really good friendship with a researcher there. He works on the types of tumors that David and Jace had. And he works with a sense of determination that just, it makes me proud to know him. And he should feel really great about the kind of work that he does, but he carries around a failure that I don't think is his burden to bear. So this is my friend, Adam Resnick. And during his entire career, he's been dedicated to the study of brain tumors. He is relentless in his pursuit of knowledge, and he often reads materials outside of his field just to better himself and his work. From scientific papers, which you would assume, to business books, which are way outside the normal researcher's reading repertoire, I think. He reads and he studies and he brings it all back to his research. And he knew another researcher that was similarly dedicated to a different field of study. They both spent long nights working in the hospital until their minds were just overflowing, and then they would walk the halls in search of just a break or some inspiration. And on these walks, sometimes they would pass each other and they'd talk about their work. My friend would talk about brain tumors, and this other researcher would talk about FOP, or fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. Ha, said it. FOP is a particularly gnarly disorder. The official description is a disorder in which the skeletal muscle and connective tissue, such as tendons and ligaments, are gradually replaced by bone, or they're ossified. This condition leads to bone formation outside the skeleton that restricts movements, and you can see the pretty horrifying picture there on the screen. In my layman's terms, these patients get frozen in their own bodies. On the surface, these two conditions, brain cancer and FOP, have nothing at all in common. The patients are affected in completely different ways. They have completely different symptoms, but the data tells a very different story, which brings me to the burden that my friend bears. You see, in all of those conversations, they never got down to a very granular level about their work. So it was only after the FOP researcher published a paper that Adam discovered that they were working on the same mutation. The inspiration that they had been walking those halls to find was right in front of them the whole time, but they didn't have the tools to see it. Data tells us a story beyond what we see on the surface, and it leads us down new paths and brings new possibilities and collaborations to life. Was it Adam's fault that he didn't discover this shared area of focus? I don't think so at all. I think it's ridiculous to assume that he would have found that shared area of focus. Like, that's a needle in a haystack. Why would he think that there was anything at all in common across those conditions? But the fact that they do share this driving mutation perfectly illustrates why data empowerment is a critical and an urgent component of medical research. I am very heavily vested in the concept of open science because I know how badly we needed access to data when David was sick. It's taken us 8 years as a foundation, but I can proudly say that we are reaching the point where not only do researchers have access to the data that they need to study brain cancer and other rare conditions, but patient families are also starting to be able to access that same kind of data in formats that are useful for them. We've got a really long way to go, but each vision that we've had is on a roadmap, and I've watched this selfless group of people continue to put the best interest of patients first, time and time again. Longitudinal clinical data sits alongside genomic data and lots of other omics, just waiting for folks like you to come and use it. I believe that empowering patient data is the greatest challenge of our generation and that our children's lives depend on it. Cancer is the #1 cause of disease death in children, which is a heartbreaking and sobering thought. They are the reason behind our sense of urgency, behind our insistence on collaborating to find kinder and more effective treatments. Each of their lives is infinitely valuable to the people that love them. They bring the faces to the data points in the vast sets of data that we're able to share with researchers. But pediatrics is also just the tip of the iceberg. We started with pediatric brain cancer because of the urgency that we felt on our own journey with David, and also the urgency that we heard from other families whose children were being given less than a year to live. But the power of big data is really almost limitless, and it doesn't end with pediatrics or with cancer even. I mean, if you think about it, big data and hyper-personalization is already an integral part of our everyday lives. We've all searched for a product and then been inundated with Facebook ads for almost exactly the same thing that you were looking for. Corporate America is precisely targeting their marketing to us, and we need that kind of precision for cancer research. The good news is we have really smart people like all of you who are the infrastructure architects and the data wranglers with the power to put all of this data to work in the same precise ways. And as you build tools to use patient data, I urge you to think about how quickly you can translate this information back to the clinic. Build with the researcher and the clinician in mind, but most especially the patient. We're working with clinical trials that are adapted to each patient based on their sequencing, giving each one the benefit of the best precision medicine that we can offer at this time. And I've just told you how those trials are progressing to lengthen life for the participants. Kids who were once given a year to live are now living for 2 years. And I know that doesn't sound like very much, but believe me when I say that that extra year with your child is worth everything. Gone are the days when doctors can, in good conscience, put every patient through the same chemotherapy regimen and call it good. Those patients now do their own research, connect with other patients, and learn about all the good and all of the bad elements of the treatment. And they use that to direct their own care in ways that are frequently more successful than what's recommended to them by their hometown oncologist. They want to share their data. so that they can improve their own experience, but also for that of their fellow patients. They quickly learned that drugs like Timodar, the drug that my son took and that so many other patients are still taking, only works for about half of the patients with high-grade gliomas. Clinicians keep prescribing it because it's the standard of care, but really there is no effective standard of care for most rare cancers. That means a curative standard of care has yet to be found, and maybe finding that standard won't come from clinicians or from the researchers. It may come from folks just like you, the people who are formatting and manipulating and sharing the data. You're creating the algorithms that just might have a shot at discerning patterns that most of our little human brains can't even wrap our heads around. If there's one thing that I want each and every one of you to walk away from this with, it's a knowledge of how critical you are to the future of precision medicine. Sure, we're always going to need those doctors and the researchers who are working the front lines against death and disease, but their tools are failing them. And you have a fresh perspective and a new arsenal to bring to the fight. So what do? You can help. Pediatrics are just the tip of the iceberg. We're out to change the prognosis for all sorts of patients, not just kids. We're not out for revenge against GBM. We're here to entirely change the narrative on how medical research is done across all life stages, across disease types, because our medical treatments shouldn't be less targeted than our ads. You can get involved with this effort by going to GitHub. There's an open PBTA, that stands for Pediatric Brain Tumor Atlas. There's a repo in GitHub. You can learn about different projects that are happening with CBTN or submit your own. That's at cbtn.org. And if you need help with anything, that same website /help. There's tons of people who would love to get you more involved with the projects going on. You can use the pediatric data sets that are in Kids First to further develop your tools. And you can use pediatric data sets as contexts for training your students and the next generation of data scientists. I hope that I've given you a little of the patient's perspective today. We are so thankful for each and every one of you. We see your work as vital. It's so important to research to translate back to the clinic. And we just really want to encourage you to keep doing it. Do it faster, but keep doing it. And please let me know if you have any questions. Oh, and I see somebody put a little thing in the chat for the Brain Tumor Atlas. Thank you for doing that. Tim, did you have anything? Oh, wait, there's a question. Did you have any recommendations as to how we can increase patient trust in data science or science in general so that the power of social media can lead patients to the right treatment, as I illustrated was? Yes, so transparency is key, right? There's definitely been a lot of issues in the past with being able to trust what is happening, for patients to trust what is happening to them, both in treatment and also how their data is used for research. Most famously, probably in the Henrietta Lacks situation. But I think that's still a question that exists today. And I believe that we go astray from that a little. This is going to be very controversial. I don't love de-identification of patient data, right? Because that keeps the patient from knowing sometimes what has happened to their data along the way. And there's nothing more gratifying to a patient or a patient family than to know that their tissue, their information was used to help someone else, especially for grieving parents, right? We want to know what happened to our child's tissue. And when it's de-identified, a lot of times there's no way of finding out if they're able to help the research process or not. So I think just being as open and as honest as you can is the most critical thing to get patients involved. I think that's the only question that I was seeing. But I did want to we've got a couple of minutes, or maybe not. I think we might be right at time. We're right at time. Okay, so thank you guys, and please reach out. I'm on Twitter all the time, so if anybody has other questions, I'm happy to engage with people.
Thank you so much. You say that he didn't have anything left to say, but it couldn't have been more false. The emphasis on how the amount of power that was used for targeting ads had been targeted at children's brain tumors, maybe things would have ended differently for some of these kids. That's pretty powerful. Thank you so much for offering to speak at the conference.
Thank you.